Welcome back, everybody. In this lecture, we're going to be talking about the topic of touch, which is otherwise known by scientists as somatosensation. We're going to define what exactly somatosensation is in this video. We'll also be talking about its utility, the different components to it, and also then how it works. We'll also spend a little bit of time exploring how we know how it works. But before we get to all these fine details around the topic of touch, maybe we should define some things first. So what is somatosensation? As I mentioned, this is touch, but touch has a lot of different elements to it. And when we talk about vision, we're really just talking about converting electromagnetic energy into something our brains can make sense of that we call light. If we're talking about our senses of taste and smell, it's all about just the conversion of molecules into, again, some type of neural package that our brain can deconstruct. When it comes to the topic of touch, it gets a little bit more multifaceted. And we can talk about touch in terms of our activation of the skin. We can talk about touch being related to pain, being able to detect temperatures, being able to detect even the presence of certain things. Touch is a very multifaceted thing. And it's why when people discuss somatosensation or touch, they like to partition it out into different categories. What you'll often hear when people talk about touch is that this is all about how our body is reacting to the environment. It's our sensory system that's programmed to send messages up the spinal cord to the brain so we can process everything that's going on in different components to the body. So you'll often hear lots of somatosensation individuals just use that term interchangeably with touch, understanding that that means we could be looking at a wide range of different things that could be activating different components to the body. If we're looking at what's happening on the skin itself, this is when we talk about something called the cutaneous senses. The senses that are a byproduct of nerves in specific areas that are found on the skin. We're actually going to break down what the skin looks like and what nerves are specifically looking at when talking about the cutaneous sense a little bit later. But just understand that there are different elements to touch that go beyond these cutaneous senses. So some people like to specify that's the sense that we're looking at. And if we're looking for why these things are so multifaceted, there's a lot we need to understand about our environment that we need to figure out from our bodies. And essentially, our somatosensation system is there to help us understand what's around us and what our situation or position in that world is so we can better help ourselves survive. I don't want to give too much, though, away about why it's so important until we do one last classification of what somatosensation is all about. So when we talk a little bit more closely about touch, you'll often hear people in sensation and perception classes and other places suggest that we should really do away with discussing what we would call the five senses. And that's because many touch individuals argue that touch is not really just one type of sense. It's actually a combination of different senses. And these combination of different senses, which sometimes can tally up to as many as 11 different extra ones, come in essentially three different forms. We have what's called exteroceptive touch, which is linked to those cutaneous senses that we just talked about earlier. This type of touch is linked to what's happening on the skin and how we're sensing some of the external world around us. And usually when we think of that, we immediately think of pain, but there's a lot more to this exteroceptive touch. Right? It's also responsible for our ability to pick up on irritations of the skin that could result in some type of an itch. It could result in our ability to pick up on the ambient temperature of the room or something that's being stretched on our skin or changes and just the presence of pressure in different areas of the body. In essence, even though we tend to link touch to pain, and in fact we'll talk about its utility with respect to pain a little bit later, it's important to note that exteroception goes well beyond just our ability to detect pain. It's our ability to really detect anything going on in our skin that we might need to know about. But this isn't the only type of touch that's really important for our survival. Another type of touch, which is critical for us to be able to ensure that the things we can't see within us are still functioning correctly, is something called interoceptive touch. This is essentially a type of touch that is a byproduct of sensors that we have inside of our bodies. I guess all of our sensors are inside of our bodies, but these are deeper inside of our bodies, even below this area that we're going to talk about in a few slides called the dermis. Right, this interoceptive touch is usually linked to different organs within our body, muscles within our body, and these organs and muscles that have these usually have them in their attempts to allow these mechanisms to communicate with us if there is some type of damage or problem going on. The classic example of interoceptive touch that many of you can probably relate to is that pain we feel in our stomach or our throat when maybe we've eaten too much or swallowed something too large. But it goes well beyond that, right? If we start to get hot internally, we sort of recognize it, even if it's not on the conscious level that we're familiar with most of our senses of touch. If, say, we're feeling a little achy or sore, right? Those senses are a byproduct of different sensors within our internal systems that are producing the right chemicals or the right signals to tell us that there is maybe a potential injury or a problem with a certain part of our body. We might not always love these aches and pains or pangs of pain because they definitely aren't necessarily desirable, but most researchers looking at it argue, just like exteroceptive touch, they're very critical players in our ability to really understand and protect all of the different organs within our body that we can't see. The last type of touch is one that's kind of overlooked, but we recognize is very important in the right situations, and it's something called proprioceptive touch. It's our ability to sort of monitor the orientation and status of all of our different body parts. Recognizing which way up and down is, recognizing our arm is above or below our head, and to the left or right of another arm, or where our foot is positioned. These types of things might not necessarily seem that critical, but we're actually going to watch a video near the end of this presentation that highlights what happens to individuals when they lose this proprioceptive touch that we, again, sort of take for granted, don't think of as very important, but is really critical in our everyday activities. Something as simple as standing and walking can be very challenging if we don't know where our body parts are. But much like some of the stuff I've mentioned earlier, I don't want to give too much away in these first couple introductory slides. Just understand for now that it is that third category of touch that's out there that's all about understanding our orientation and positioning. So now that we've detailed the different functions of touch, I do want to take a step back and have us reflect on why touch is so unbelievably important. Most of us think of touch again as our means of detecting pain and maybe being able to navigate in our environment, but this ability to detect these things cannot be overlooked when we examine how many dangers there are around us at any given moment. And to appreciate kind of the importance of somatosensation, I always like to reference a weird old video from a movie that you might have seen when you were a child named Mrs. Doubtfire. If you've never seen it, understand that this movie was a little odd even for its time, and it starred Robin Williams as he attempted to play a nanny for his own children so he could spend more time with them. And to play this nanny, he decided for some inexplicable reason to dress up like a woman and wear this bodysuit that theoretically did not allow his ex-wife to recognize who he was. I'm not sure the context is even that important, but what you have to understand when you watch this video is that you're seeing Robin Williams acting in this movie as somebody who's wearing a bodysuit and not capable of detecting touch through this bodysuit the same way we are when we don't have giant pieces of plastic on us. And you're going to see very quickly within this video a couple follies that he commits when he loses a lot of his basic elements of touch. You should see in this video just a couple minutes, I'm going to double check that it's the right one, that really highlight exactly how important just our basic types of exteroceptive touch are. Now, if we want to go beyond just the basic survival function of touch, numerous studies over the last couple decades have highlighted that touch definitely helps in kind of unforeseen areas as well. One of the classic examples of the importance of touch has often been cited when we look at newborn infants and their interactions with their mothers, and also the mother's interactions with those newborn infants. Numerous studies have shown that just activating certain areas of the skin can not only produce activity in areas of the brain responsible for understanding what parts of the body are being activated and touched, but they can also create a cascade of information that goes to other areas. One particular area is a structure within our brain that we call our endocrine system, or I guess a collection of structures within our brain called the endocrine system. And this area is responsible for the production of these chemicals called hormones. Essentially a version of neurotransmitters that are not secreted into synapses, but instead secreted into our bloodstream. And what numerous studies have shown is that there is a pathway between our touch areas of the brain, which we'll be looking at very shortly, and numerous components to this endocrine system. Now, sometimes when we have certain types of touch signals sent to the brain, our endocrine system goes nuts and it circulates things that can create large amounts of stress. But other times, if we are touched, say on the back, or if we're held, or there's something that's soothing done to our body, this can actually activate different areas of the endocrine system that start to produce massive amounts of a really interesting hormone called oxytocin. This hormone's been tied to numerous things. It's been tied to the reduction of stress, it's been tied to happiness, and if we're looking at the mother, newborn, infant idea that I mentioned earlier, it's also been tied to bonding. Numerous studies have shown that usually bonds are formed very quickly if large amounts of oxytocin are kind of coursing through the veins of individuals when they engage in some type of tactile touch. In fact, this has been shown to help alleviate some types of aggression toward other species that we've seen in not necessarily cross-breeding, but cross interactions between species that don't often engage with each other. It's essentially a way of ensuring through touch and the way it reaches the brain that we can find ways to diffuse tension and problems and maybe even create closer bonds simply through contact. Now, there's a lot more to this story than that, and I encourage you, if you're interested in it, to go look for it. But I want us to appreciate with this slide that touch is not just about detecting danger for survival. It's also maybe something that's a catalyst for forming greater bonds that can help us for survival as well. There's also a litany of research that's indicated that even though we sometimes don't necessarily embrace touch as an important characteristic to communication, more and more evidence highlights the importance of touch in effective communication. In our current society, with lots of people suddenly social distancing, I think there's a much greater appreciation for how important a hug or a hold of the hand or even just a slap on the back can be to feel like you're connected with other individuals and that you're on the same page as them. But even before we sort of had this intuitive recognition that touch can really help friendships, we've learned that for effective communication, for the ability to pick up on what others are doing, touch is a pretty critical component. There's been numerous studies to show that if we're not allowed to gesture, to feel physical contact of, say, our hands slapping together or a movement of our arms when we're trying to communicate with people, our messages do get a little muddled. This is why actually most instructors are encouraged to sort of pace around and move their hands and gesture when communicating, because not only does it tend to get the message across a little bit more clearly to the receiver, but it actually can aid in the communication process. It can help the person talking come across more clearly and kind of keep their train of thought a little bit more easily. There's also numerous studies that have shown that some of the best forms of communication and bonds are kind of formed and held through touch. There's actually been studies to show that basketball teams in the NBA can predictably be more or less successful based on how much contact they make during timeouts and other pauses within the game. Other studies have shown that there's a great deal of predictive validity in how much a couple is touching with each other with respect to the kind of longevity and reported happiness levels within that relationship. Now, obviously, there are some circular reasoning issues that we have to attend to, but nonetheless, even if we account for those, there does seem to be a significant amount of evidence to highlight that touch, again, goes beyond just survival. It's something that can really help enrich relationships and strengthen some of the bonds that people form. So what are these receptors on the skin that we keep alluding to here? I've mentioned it a number of different times when we've talked about what we call their cutaneous sense, or the difference between exteroception and interoception. Let's finally break down what it is we're discussing when we talk about how our skin helps us determine things like pain and temperature and pressure changes. To understand that, we have to first differentiate the skin on two different levels. The top level of our skin, the thing that we see, is called by biologists and people studying touch the epidermis. It's a relatively thin layer in comparison to the structures underneath it. And if we go just below the epidermis, before we get to organs and other major components of our body, we've got this other fatty layer that's called the dermis. And a large number of our sensory neurons responsible for our exteroception are either found in the epidermis or the dermis. We do have a few on the epidermis that are responsible for picking up on subtle senses of touch. We also, to kind of help that surface of us, have a number of other neurons that have dendrites wrapping around the hair follicles that can also help us pick up on movement and touch. But there's a large number of additional ones that are underneath that epidermis found in the dermis that can help us determine things like changes in temperature, pressure, etc. And these cells require a little bit more stimulation to actually be activated. Now, this is not a sensation and perception class, so we are not going to go into all the details about how these cells differentiate from each other and exactly what types of chemical things they're looking for in order to react. That just gets way too dense, and it's tough to keep track of all the moving parts that are involved. But if you understand that we have a few limited number of sensor cells that are picking up on touch in the epidermis, and a large number that are found in that second layer called the dermis, it can help us pick up on, again, changes in temperature, pressure, vibration, and even how those cells that are picking up on changes in touch by latching onto the hair follicles, well, then you have a good sense of the kind of general structures that make up our touch system for our cutaneous sense or our exteroception. It's probably also important to note that these are not just a few cells that are located along the skin. We actually have, most people estimate, billions of these cells that are located throughout the skin that help us pick up on that sensation process. This leads us to then where that information eventually goes. So if we look at the end product of our sense of touch, there's a lot of stops along the way, but eventually all information travels to the brain. In particular, it travels to an area that we call our primary somatosensory cortex. This is something we talked about earlier in our neuroscience class. So we've got these sensors that pick up information, and those sensors usually send that information, except for a small limited few, to the spinal cord. And that information traverses up the spinal cord. Actually, if you want more information, up the back of our spinal cords, what's called the dorsal area. It goes through our lower cortical regions, takes a stop off at the thalamus for a lot of that filtering that we've talked about earlier, and eventually works its way up to that primary somatosensory cortex. And it's there where we start getting into the process of perception, something that we kind of talked about with vision. If we're looking at everything that happens before then, a lot of people argue that those activities are merely noise. Right? That's the message that's coming from the body up to the brain, but we don't actually experience touch, be it exteroception, interoception, or proprioception, until that information reaches the brain. And the way we experience touch and also react to that touch is a byproduct of not only what's happening on this primary somatosensory cortex, but also the information that gets processed in the areas that that information is then sent to. What's called the posterior parietal cortex, which is the kind of area behind the primary somatosensory cortex, and the primary motor cortex, which, as we mentioned before, is in front of that primary somatosensory cortex, and it's really involved in the first initiations of movement. I'm guessing just based on that little brief description of the primary motor cortex and its name, you can gather what happens when information travels up to that primary somatosensory cortex and then quickly floods up to the primary motor cortex. It's a little maybe more complex to understand what happens when that information flows back. Think of our reactions as being a byproduct of the information coming up that spills into the front area, and our processing, our making sense of that tactile information being a byproduct of what happens when that information goes back. There's also a volley between a lot of these different regions so we can coordinate our movements better and essentially use touch the way it's designed to be used. So even though we usually talk about this information coming to a peak and then dispersing in front and back, if we actually looked at this under a scanner, what we see is this massive amount of activity that happens when we experience a sensation that's able to reach its way through the thalamus and get up to that primary somatosensory cortex. You've got equal distribution forward and back, and then a volley between the different areas so we can coordinate our movements and understand what it is we're experiencing a little bit better. To understand this primary somatosensory cortex a little bit better, though, I do want to highlight something that I alluded to when we talked about the brain. This very odd thing that we sometimes like to highlight in this talk called the somatosensory homunculus, which is represented by that weird-looking person that you see over there on your right. And this somatosensory homunculus is not just some random artist's rendition of a human being. It's actually a rendition of the proportions of area within our brain, in particular our primary somatosensory cortex, that are dedicated to specific body parts. What we see when we look at people's brains and which areas are activated when certain parts of the body are being touched is that there are some areas of our body where there's a lot of representation on the brain. A classic example of this is the face, the lips, and the hand. A huge percentage of our brain space on this primary somatosensory cortex is dedicated to processing all the information coming from those sources. In fact, if we use those even more, we can see people's brains adjusting to have even more space than what you see represented here, dedicated to processing that information. We have small swaths of areas in our brain that are dedicated to other kind of less utilized parts of the body. My favorite example is that lower back that you see, where we have a huge, usually lower back, that's only given a very small corner office when looking at how much area of our brain is dedicated to processing that information. And this usually brings me to a really fun task if we were taking this as an in-person class. What I like to do is engage in an activity that I call the 2 points task, where people pair up with other individuals, they get a pair of pens out, and they pick one body area to start with, either the hands, the lower back, or usually I like to do the back of the calves as well, just because it's very similar to the lower back. And what we do in this activity is we have one person be the pricker with the 2 pens, and the other person being the prickee, we could call it. And the pricker takes the 2 pens, puts them in either that area around the finger or the back or the legs, and pokes the person with 1 or 2 pens. In the beginning, the pens should be right next to each other, and the person being pricked needs to report whether or not they felt 1 prick or 2. Now, to ensure some type of control, sometimes the pricker does prick the person with just 1 of the pens. Other times they prick them with both the pens, and the aim is to try to prick them at the same time if you're using 2 pens, and see if the person can detect the differences. If the person can't detect the differences, the pricker is supposed to kind of slowly move those pens apart from each other as they're successively pricking them over and over again, seeing if the person can detect 1 or 2 pricks. And what we find in this activity, which is really fun, is that people usually can detect 2 specific points of pressure when you're just about a millimeter apart on the finger, on the pointer finger or the thumb. But when you go to the lower back, usually it's about 1.5 inches to 2 inches before you can detect 2 points. And unless you're somebody that uses your legs a lot for certain activities, usually you have to get up to about 2 to 3 inches before you can detect 2 points being pricked on you when you get to the calves. This really highlights how important having space on your brain dedicated to processing certain types of touch is. There's also, if you're wondering, a homunculus for our primary motor cortex, and there is a lot of overlap between the two of them, but it's probably kind of neat to note here that they're not perfectly aligned. And that's because sometimes our sense of touch is all we get for responding to our environment. We can't necessarily move our stomach or our small intestines or even our teeth, but we can still feel pain in those areas. And that's a great way to kind of detect problems. It's just we don't have the ability to take care of those problems when we feel that pain. So we dedicate other areas of the brain to areas where we can't move things, but can still, maybe move others that can help us. It's a really neat, again, odd-looking representation of touch, and it really speaks to the unique mapping that we have in the brain. Now, if we were in an in-person class, we'd get to close out this lecture by watching 2 really interesting videos that explore different components to what we've discussed so far. The first video, which I don't have a link for in this class, was one that explored the really interesting effects that started to happen to a gentleman who had lost his arm in a tragic accident. It was exploring how, after the accident occurred, he started experiencing these things that we call phantom limb pains. How he would feel itches and aches and other things on this arm that was no longer there. Eventually, it started to create these really weird effects where when he was shaving his face, he'd start to feel tingles and kind of scratches in this, again, phantom arm that was there. This video then went on to talk about the overlapping areas in that homunculus between our face and our arms and hands, and how this particular effect is actually somewhat common because of how the brain does rewrite itself and have things link up along that primary somatosensory cortex. And that gives us a good appreciation of generally how that brain structure we talked about earlier works in our everyday experiences. We don't have the time necessarily, though, to watch that video in conjunction with these because we can't necessarily be really streamlined. So instead, I decided to focus our attention on one last video for this class. And it's one that explores what happens when a lot of those somatosensation experiences we discussed don't occur. Now, obviously, we can look at people who lose all senses of touch, and in doing so, really kind of understand how important all these different senses of touch actually are. But instead, I thought we would look at an individual who lost just components to his sense of touch while being able to maintain his motor system fairly well. It's actually a somewhat common thing when you learn about the pathways where our nerves are going up to the brain and down for our sense of touch and motion, and that those pathways are actually different. As I mentioned before, in the back of our spinal cord is where most of the information coming from our body eventually is sent up to the brain so we can process it. Our motor system is actually controlled by information traveling from the brain down the front of our spinal cord out to the body. So in some cases, individuals can receive damage to the back sides of their spinal cords, losing touch and losing things like proprioception and other components. And in doing so, have little to no touch in certain areas while still being able to move their body. I actually have a friend and colleague that had this occur to him as a result of a surgery problem where there was probably a nerve nicked or something else that happened during a surgery on the back. And that the byproduct of this is kind of odd sometimes, where these individuals can still interact with their environment, but not knowing where their body is, not having a sense of pain, can come at a pretty big cost. And to see kind of an extreme version of this case, I wanted us to watch this video that I think is entitled The Man Without a Body. It's just kind of a weird name for it, that highlights the life of this gentleman pictured here named Ian Waterman. If you can, watch it through its entirety and the exploration of all the interesting components to his inability to really touch and experience the world around him. Hopefully you've had a chance to watch that video, and if you have, well, we're reaching the end of this lecture. As a reminder of what we've covered, when we looked at this topic of somatosensation, we first defined what it was, all the different components to it, and then tried to talk about the different things that touch was useful for. Lastly, we explored the neurological components to it when looking at the brain, how it worked, and how that was critical in perception of touch, and then how there was this relay system between our motor system and our sense of touch that was critical for us to explore our world. Hopefully after watching this, you have a newfound appreciation for all of the cool nerves that you have along your skin and within your body, and you can now appreciate when people talk about touch, all the complexity to it, just a little bit more. If that's been done, well, congratulations. It's time to move on. So we will be, as we progress now, moving on to new topics within the cognitive realm. This is sort of related to the cognitive realm, I guess. So make sure that you have everything read and you're ready to go when we explore topics like learning and reactions to the environment around us. I'll see you then.